Yesterday, at the farm, I went to do a peek in the bargain tent. And I turned around to leave to go to the jousting arena, and I turned so quickly I stepped in a hole in the grass and twisted my ankle. It didn't hurt so much right at the moment, but it hurt really a lot last night. So I have Joseph, Jacob, and Kate who want to help me get out on stage. And I have my water. And Colby said I have to have a chair, and I said no, I didn't want it. And I said, are you forcing me? And he said yes. So I let him have his way so he could feel like a cavalier. Thank you, my sweet children. See you later. Thanks, honey. But I've been putting lots of lemongrass, Cool Azul, Helichrysum, and everybody comes up and looks and said, well, it's not bruised. I said, well, you don't bruise with oils. Gary always warned, if you use Pain Away and some of our other products, because of some pain that you have, you better be careful, because you might think you don't have a problem because you don't see anything. Is that not true? Yeah. It's kind of funny with me. It seems like all my life, I look down at something on the floor and I trip over it. And Gary would watch me do that, and he'd just sit back and he'd laugh. He said, oh, Mary, oh, Mary. I don't know why it's me. Sometimes I feel like I'm a train wreck. Do you feel like that sometimes? But you know what? You just put the engine back on the track and you keep going. That's what you do. It's rather interesting for me when I was told that they wanted to title my presentation Mary's Moxie. Do you understand the word moxie? Perhaps for those of you who don't speak English, moxie is a funny word in the English language that means you got guts to do things. You speak out, you go forward, you do what you gotta do. You know, I remember when Joseph was taking karate. He was like about 7 years old. And in the back room, they had a candy machine. Now, Joseph is very anti-sugar, and he can give you quite a dissertation on how sugar will kill you. So here's another little boy, and he puts his quarter in, and he holds his hands out, and he gets all this candy, and Joseph came around the corner and saw that, and he walked over to the little boy and went, whack! He said, don't eat that, that'll kill you. Oh, Joseph. Now that's Joseph's moxie. That's a great example of moxie. But I had to explain to him that that was not his choice. If the little boy wanted to have the candy, that's probably because his mother gave him a quarter. I didn't give Joseph a quarter. And my boys are label readers. We'd go to Whole Foods, and it was so fun. Every time we come home from Ecuador, we'd go from the airport to Whole Foods. Because in Ecuador, it's very difficult to buy anything without sugar in it. So we go to Whole Foods and we walk around, buy all this wonderful stuff before we go home, and Gary would always say, now, read the label. Oh, that has food coloring in it. No, put that back. Ooh, we don't want that. Can you even pronounce that word? No, put that back. Oh, I don't want this. Oh, that's got corn syrup in it. Nah, put that back. So my boys know how to read labels. And I think one of the greatest things you could do for your children is to teach them how to read labels so that when they do go and shop, they know what they're buying. Because there is so much garbage in the food nowadays, we have to be pretty clever to be able to buy food that doesn't have stuff in it that we don't want. But my moxie began when I was little, very little. And John's going to help me with these slides because he knows them better. He knows them as well as I do. But look at that little face right there. That's at 7 months. It's like, watch out, world, here I come. But I didn't know exactly what that was going to mean. I look a lot like my mother there. I have the same white cheeks. And if you see on singers, part of what enables the voice to resonate in a louder way is from the bone structure in the face. So if you have a lot of bone here and bone up here, and you look at singers, most of the time they will have a lot of bone up here. My mother was a wonderful singer. She played the accordion, the piano. My father was a wonderful pianist, conductor, and we had an organ and a piano in our home, and I grew up listening to my parents play both of those instruments together. But my father was a little mean because he would change keys on my mom when they were playing, and poor mom would say, "Alan, slow down, don't do that to me." But he was so good. We had a lot of laughter, and we always had so much music in our home. Music was everything. You see this sassy little girl right here? My grandma took this picture when we were walking home from church. And that was the fence outside our home. But I was full of it, believe me. My first experience singing, I don't know if it was my first experience, but my earliest memory was singing for somebody's wedding. I was 3 or 4 years old. Go back, John. And all I can remember was this green satin dress, and I can remember looking down and watching it swirl. I don't know where it took place. I don't know who it was for. This is all I remember, the green dress, and I just want you to imagine this sassy little girl singing. I love you truly, truly, dear. Life with its sorrow, life with its tears, fades into dreams when I feel you are near, dear. For I love you truly, truly, dear. Growing up, I sang and I sang and I sang and I sang everywhere for everything. And in my high school years, I would often get calls to come and do programs, Christmas programs for banks and insurance companies. And I had a lot of fun. And what I loved the very most is I could walk in to the room, and you know, sometimes people are not as cheery as you wish they were. And I could see their faces. And when I started to sing, they would light up. And I would go home knowing that I brought happiness into someone's life. That was all about my singing. That's what I love so much about singing. So where do you go? Well, living in Utah, there's not a lot of opportunity to really go into the big time. And at that time in our lives, Europe was the place to go if you were going to learn to sing. If you wanted to perform, especially in the operatic world, which was what I loved. So this girl, her name was Lori Lynn, we called her Gogi, and she and I went to Lausanne, Switzerland to study French. And we had a great time, but Gogi's father was a retired colonel in the Air Force, and they had lived in Libya. So we went to the bookstore and we bought a map of the Mediterranean. And I got the harebrained idea to hitchhike around the Mediterranean Sea. And Gogi thought that was going to be a lot of fun because she knew that side of the Mediterranean. She knew Africa. So on December 19th, which was my father's birthday, we packed up, and this is how we looked. We had a criteria. Whoever was driving the car had to have a clean car. Only one driver, and he had to be dressed neatly. If there was any dirt, we said no thank you. We had a fabulous time. Someday maybe I'll write about all my adventures, but it was just one after another, after another, after another, and it was a glorious experience for me. Well, we were in Beirut, Lebanon, walking down the street because we were going to hitchhike to Damascus, because we had a friend who lived in Damascus who was in our class in Lausanne, and she had invited us to come. So we're walking down the street, you know, just waiting for somebody to come, and this handsome Arab boy pulls up in a red Corvette, a convertible, and he said, "Where are you going?" We said, "We're going to Damascus." He said, "Oh, you can't go. The roads are closed because of the snow. Tell you what, you go in that little cafe house and wait for me. I'm going to take my girlfriend to the airport because she's a stewardess for Middle East Airlines, and she was from Germany." So we thought, yeah, sure. So we went in there. He came back, picked us up, and he said, "Why don't you become stewardesses?" Well, I'm up for the adventure. Gogi had always wanted to be a stewardess. I didn't know what that meant, so I said, okay. So we went out, and of course getting a couple of Americans was really a coup because English was the working language. And to have Americans with more, what should I say, experience in the world and knowing how to talk to strangers and foreigners was really wonderful for them. So we went through their 6 weeks of training, which was absolutely hilarious. And then we started flying. But you know what I discovered? And please don't take offense if you're an airline stewardess and you liked it. But I came to the conclusion that being an airline stewardess is just a glorified waitress job. And I didn't want to do it. I wanted to go and sing. I wanted to go to Vienna. So I had made contact with a teacher. She accepted to have me come and audition for her, which I did. She accepted me. And so I entered the Academy of Music und Darstellende Kunst, Academy for Music and the Performing Arts, which is now a university in Vienna, Austria. And it was a glorious, glorious, glorious experience for me. I learned German, which I love immensely. And I'm always happy when I can speak a little German. But I was able to sing all kinds of little operas. This was the first opera that Mozart wrote, called Bastien und Bastienne. You probably never even heard of it. But it was fun. It was my first experience on the stage. But there were many experiences. Come on, John, let's go. This was the first opera house I sang in, which is the Stadttheater in Klagenfurt, which is in the southern border of Austria. And I sang the part of Pauline in La Vie Parisienne. Oh my goodness, it was so fun. I just loved everything that I did. Keep going, John, come on. I had a very interesting experience. That little theater that you saw there, the Schönbrunner Schlosstheater, is the Kaiser's private opera house on the grounds of his private summer palace. If you've been to Austria, I'm sure you've been to Schönbrunn. It is absolutely gorgeous. Many, many movies have been filmed in that palace. But we were a group of students, and we decided we were going to put on an opera ourselves. So I did the Susanna in the Marriage of Figaro, Così and Cose fan tutte, and everybody would say, "Who is that? Where does she come from?" Nobody ever guessed I was an American, and they thought maybe I was Czechoslovakian with whatever accent they thought I had. It was fun. But after I sang the Marriage of Figaro, And Susanna is one of the longest roles in all of opera literature. And it was so successful. We sold every seat. I think we did it for 3 or 4 nights. But I walked out the side stage door, and I'm walking down the long corridor. Well, it's outside, the sidewalk up against the wall of the stage. And I came around the corner, and Schönbrunn is surrounded by like 20-foot wrought iron fence. Really massive, and they have a little door in the fence. You walk through that gate, and my car was parked out on the outside, and I had a little VW that my father bought for $1,300, and my sister and I hitchhiked to Wolfsburg, Germany, and I drove it out of the factory new. So that's how I ended up with a little car that took me all over Europe, everywhere, and it was a really fabulous blessing that my Father provided for me. But I got in my car, I put the key in the ignition, I went to turn it on, I had one hand on the steering wheel, and this horrific feeling came over me. Mary, it's time to go home. What? I don't want to go home. No. Yes, it's time to go home. I just put my head down on the wheel. I'm going, no, I don't want to go home. But the feeling was so intense, I couldn't deny it. So I drove my car to Bremerhaven, put it on a ship, and shipped it to Baltimore. I waited about 3 weeks, then boarded the train, the Bahnhof in Vienna, crying and crying, and all my friends are standing on the gangway. We're all crying. Why is Mary leaving? Why is Mary leaving? That horrific, overwhelming feeling. I didn't have a reason to come home. I didn't have anybody to come home to except my family. What was I gonna do? I didn't know. I was offered the part of Adela in Die Fledermaus, which I couldn't resist, and that was my last experience of singing in Vienna before I went home. And it was a glorious experience, a glorious role to sing. And that was my whole life. That was everything about me. And I didn't want anything else. I wanted to sing. I loved the stage, I loved the drama, I loved the costumes, I loved the interaction. I just loved it. Picked up my car at the dock in Baltimore and headed for Utah. Came down Parley's Canyon, through the mountains, and it was about 9 o'clock at night, and here are all the lights of the city. And I just went, ah, so beautiful. Pulled into the driveway of my parents' home, and of course everybody was excited to see me. And I thought, what am I going to do? Glade Peterson, who's a Utahtan who sang with Zurich Opera as the main tenor, was also intending to come home. I met with him in Zurich, and he said, Mary, I want to start an opera company in Utah. You want to help me? And I said, sure, but I don't know if I'm going home. Here I was. And Glade called me a month later and said, Mary, you want to help me? Well, yeah, sure. So I and many of my singing friends became part of the beginning of Utah Opera, and I sang with Utah Opera for 10 years. I sang many main roles. I sang Musette in La Boheme, Anna and Lustige Weiber, what's that? Merry Wives of Windsor. These are some of the things that I sang. Norina and Don Pasquale, that was a huge, huge, fabulous experience for me. But my father got involved in a gold mine that didn't exist. He invested in a gold mine that didn't exist. Anybody know what this is? Take a guess. What do you think it is? 2 big balls of gold. that we took out of the mine in Caucasia, Colombia. And I lived in Caucasia for 1 year. I and my brother and another friend went to Caucasia to save the investment that many people had faith in and were losing their money. This is me operating a big front end loader. It was a lot of fun. I loved big equipment. There was no cliff, there was nowhere where I could drop off, so that was safe. Here we're cleaning out the sluice, and of course we didn't know any better. They put mercury in the sluice box, and mercury picks up the little pieces of gold, and then you put it in a cheesecloth and you squeeze out the mercury, and then you burn the rest of it off, and what's left you put muriatic acid on it and burn it off. Can you imagine how toxic that was? And I didn't know any better. I know what it's like to have mercury poisoning, believe me. And I would come home and my head would just spin. We sold our mining adventure, our mining operation, and we came back to Utah about 2 years later. Frankly, I think it was a waste of 2 years of my life. I don't know what I learned except that I could have a good conversation about fine gold recovery and fine gold mining. I saw a lot of death. I saw a lot of horrific stupidity of people trying to mine. I don't know, there's something when you have gold fever. If you haven't seen someone with gold fever, you can't understand it, but it's like they go crazy for gold. For me, it was just a means of paying the bills and recovering what was lost, which in the end, we never did. We barely broke even in being able to pay our workers. But I was grateful to come home. But how strange it is, all the experiences that we have in life. That was a business adventure, but you know, business for me started when I was about 7 years old. And when my father was in chiropractic school, we had a garden, and my sister and I used to follow Dad every night down to the garden with all the fireflies blinking, and we'd hoe weeds and we'd pick the vegetables and everything. You know, back in Illinois, vegetables grow really well. And our radishes were fantastic. So I got the idea, and we loaded the radishes in the wagon, and we went from house to house selling radishes. This was actually my very first business adventure. But it was fun. I think people felt sorry for us, you know, just 3 little kids out there trying to make some money, and all those little nickels and dimes. I thought I was rich. It was fantastic. But then I also had another business adventure, and that was a t-shirt business. And on this t-shirt it said things like, "Love makes our house a home," "Lengthen your stride," "I'm a child of God." And in those days, you cut the designs out with an X-Acto knife, and then you burned the screens, and then you set up all the screens, and you ran this big equipment. I could do it all. But it was tough learning, lots of mistakes. But I was fascinated with it, always something new, something to learn. Look at that garbage dump where we worked. But we'd go down, we'd start at midnight because the people who owned the shop were running their stuff. So we had to do it all night long when the machine wasn't being used. And then we'd go in and sell our t-shirts. One day, Mother and I had a booth at the Utah State Fair selling t-shirts. And I went walking around looking at the different booths, and I came upon this booth where this gentleman was selling aluminum welding rod. Well, we needed aluminum welding rod at the mine. This was during the summer when I came home to help Mother with the shirts. We were still mining in Colombia. And I'm talking to him about the welding rod and everything, and he pulls out of his pocket a bottle of stevia, and he sticks it in my face, and he said, would you be interested in a natural sweetener? He had no idea who he was talking to, because I'd grown up in a health-minded home. My father was a chiropractor. We didn't have white sugar, we didn't have white salt, we ground our own wheat. Mother made bread every week. We bottled peaches and pears and anything imaginable. We'd freeze the raspberries, freeze the cherry.
I cut out. Oh, whoa.
Boring. It's not on either, is it? Oh, I hate this. Anyway, I went to the meeting, and I was fascinated. My first introduction to multi-level marketing. But I didn't like that business. I didn't want anything to do with it, because I was of the mindset that people in the multi-level marketing business, those at the top, suck the money bottom, and I was at the bottom, and I didn't like it. Anybody here feel that way when you were first introduced to the direct selling industry? Oh, come on, there's more of you out there. Yeah, lots of you. Come on, don't be shy. I'm just like you. This was my Chinese herb business. I got a check for $5. Oh my goodness, how did I get that? Where'd that come from? The next month it was $100, and I didn't know why. So I decided it might be a good thing to read the policies and procedures. You know how we all just check the box? Ooh, I hope the attorneys aren't here listening to that. But that's what we do. We don't want to be bothered. I didn't want to be bothered. But I read through it and I thought, oh my goodness gracious, I'm missing out. I had no idea this was possible. I had no idea I could make money. And we were in dire straits because of the mining operation, so I got excited. And I learned a lot. I learned how to stand on stage and give meetings, and you know what? I'm really a shy person. I like to sit on the very last row and not have to say anything. Well, you have a choice. You can either stand on stage and look stupid like you don't know what you're doing, or you can stand on stage and act like you know what you're doing. Which did I want? No, that was obvious. And I loved the stage. It was not strange to be on stage, but in the music world, you simply memorize it, go out on stage and sing what you memorize and walk off stage. Where I am standing right now today, I am ad-libbing. I am not reading this off the screen. I'm just telling you the story. But I discovered that I could call people out of the audience like, hey, Barbara, stand up and tell me what you think about this product. John, tell us what you think about that product. But what do? Sit there and say no or stand up? They stand up. And it's fascinating how when people get started talking about something they love, they forget that they're afraid. You can do the same thing. Invite your people to join you. Be part of the presentation. Never do it by yourself. Because always when you stand here, you're in a teaching mode. You're the example. You're helping them do what you know they can do with their people. It starts with the top. You fix me? Oh, thank you, Josh. You get stars in heaven. So I was at the Salt Palace. I had a great Chinese herb business going, and I loved it. My goal was to make $2,000 a month, and I thought I could be happy the rest of my life. By the end of the year, I was making $10,000 a month. I couldn't believe it. I couldn't comprehend it. Wow, it's like a miracle. Blessings from heaven. But you know why it grew? It grew because every single person I brought into that business with me, I cared about. I wanted everyone to be successful. I had a motto: it's not fun to make money unless everybody's making money. And I made sure that those who wanted to be successful were going to be successful or not be successful because I didn't care. I cared and I did what it took to help those people who wanted to be successful. And I had a fabulous organization, I had fabulous leaders, and I always said if I dropped dead, it wouldn't change one thing in my organization. They would all keep going because they were all so independent and strong and knew how to do the business. That's what you want. You don't want people dependent on you. It's one thing to have financial freedom, but it's a whole other thing to have time freedom. Oh my goodness gracious. You like being on the phone? Non-stop, all day long? Half the night? Oh, that's not for me. And I had a hard time talking on the phone, but once I got going, it was like a wheel in motion, and I would just call everybody. And when I would hear their voice, I would get excited. I was thrilled that they were involved, that they cared. You know, most of you are silvers. I know we have a few golds with us, we have a few diamonds, a few platinums. And it's fun to have the leadership here, to all be together, to learn from one another. But you want to help those in your organization grow with you. And sometimes we forget that as they succeed, you succeed. You cannot grow and be successful without those in your organization. So you need to take care of them. Well, I'm at the Salt Palace. I was into all of those big organizations, Preparedness Expo, Total Health, and I love to walk around and look at everything. It just so happened that this year there were like 10,000 people there. It was hard to move around. And there was a gentleman who was a write-in for the President of the United States, and I really liked him, so I wanted to hear him speak. And I was sitting in the last row in the bleachers, way on top. And this is what he said at the end of his speech. It's the only thing I remember. Whatever you do, make sure you check out those oils. Oils? Oils? What are oils? What's he talking about? Thank you very much. I walked off stage. I thought, boy, this guy is weird. So I started looking to find out what he was talking about. And I came to a booth, to an aisle, and I looked down and I could see a sign that said essential oils. Oils, maybe. But there were so many people, I couldn't get down the aisle, so no big deal. And I walked away. I was usually the last person out. I like to be there after it closed down because most of the people are gone and you can walk up and down the aisle and talk and look without being almost knocked over. So I came to the oil booth and there's a teenager standing behind the table. And I said, so tell me about your essential oils. And he spouted off a few things. And he spouted off something about his eyesight improving. Well, I was curious. He said, well, you know, Gary Young's standing out there in the aisle. Why don't you go ask him what his formula is? So I walked over to Gary, and I got to tell you, I'll be really honest with you, I felt so nervous that I don't know why. It's the strangest thing that happened. There was an energy thing, and I didn't know a lot about energy, but I was uncomfortable. So I walked up, and I said, the young boy in the booth tells me that you have a really cool formula for eyes. Can you give it to me? So he gave it to me and I wrote it down. And Gary later on said, I don't remember. He could hardly speak. He'd been talking nonstop for 3 days and didn't have a voice left. So the young boy had invited me to a meeting, which I couldn't go to. And I said, yeah, if you come back, call me, no big deal. No loss, right? A month later, they called, and I went, and I sat at the back, and I listened, and I became fascinated with what I heard. There was nobody there to say, yeah, Mary, this is really great stuff. I didn't know one single person there. And I thought, well, I'll sign up to get the products wholesale. I signed up. They stuck me under somebody I didn't know, somebody who never one time called me. And I would have been the lucky find for that person, believe me. I was kind of mouthy at the meeting, and I let it be known that I would never build a business with such a terrible marketing plan. And I got a call from the Young Living office, spoke to somebody who said, Gary's on his way to Egypt. Could you please go to the airport and pick him up because he needs batteries for his camera and he has to go to the bank? No, I don't want to. Oh, isn't there somebody else who can go? No, not me. No, everybody's working. I don't want to do this. I don't want to do this. Who's this Gary Young? Ah. So in those days they had white phones. You could pick them up and call, and there'd be a loudspeaker. We don't do those kinds of things anymore. But we found each other, and I found him to be quite interesting as we drove into town. Oh, Mary, talking. So I took him to the camera shop. I took him to the bank. He invited me for lunch at the Hilton. So while we're having lunch, he offers me a job as his director of marketing. And I said, not a chance. I don't want a job. I'm financially independent. No way. But I will help you. That's how it really began with Gary. And he said to me, well, I understand you don't like my marketing plan. And I said, who am I to tell you what kind of a marketing plan to have? I can still hear myself saying that, thinking, you're right about that, bud. He said, well, would you help me? Maybe we can change it, make it better. It's so odd how it all evolved. It's like we had known each other forever. It's like we had been talking with each other forever. As you know, Gary had a research facility in Mexico where he studied the blood, where he created formulas, studied the blood after people had the formulas, and then he looked and he watched to see if he was getting the results that he wanted. But he realized that what he had belonged to the world. So he sold everything and moved to Reno and then to Spokane. And here, 1989, he moved out of Mexico in 88. And here in 1989, he moved to Spokane, Washington. And this was an old convalescent home that he bought, and it was a dump, but he made an office out of it. He had meetings there. I don't know if you can tell, that's Eldon Nettle right there in the front. Eldon was a long time friend of Gary's, and he and his wife Nancy loved the oils, and they were the two who really helped him get going in the beginning. So it's kind of fun to see this old picture. But this is what Gary did. He would answer the phones during the week. He would run to the back room and fill the orders. He would ship them. Then once a month, he would lay all the orders out on the floor in chronological order and calculate commissions by hand. About 4 or 5 years ago, I wanted to see if I could get a picture of the old building. And when I got there, I found the building was gone. This is exactly the 1/4 acre that was behind the building where Gary planted the first lavender. And it was this lavender that was transported and transplanted in the ground in St. Mary's. This is where it all began. And what was so funny is that lavender takes 3 years to mature before you can cut it to distill. But this lavender grew so well and Gary was so anxious to know that he decided to cut it after 2 years. He sent the few drops that he pulled out. And here's his distiller. He welded 2 pressure cookers together, and he put holes in the bottom part, and that's where he put the water, and on the top part he put the plants. And when he turned the stove on, it would heat the water and create steam, and it would come up through the 2 pressure cookers, and he hooked a spout on the outside of it, and that's how he got his oil. It's quite ingenious, I must say. Kurt said that's the finest lavender he'd ever seen. Where did he get it? I distilled it from the plants that I grew in my backyard. Oh, no, come on, Gary. No, I really did. He said, that's amazing. That's all that Gary needed to spur him on. That's all. Gary was fantastic at doing blood analysis, and that's why he has the screen there, the TV with his microscope. But you see those little bottles? That was the very beginning of his venture into the world of essential oils. And he was always mixing and matching. He came to the conclusion that if you could blend particular oils together, you could get more results than if you just had an oil singularly. He knew that he needed more ground. So in 1992, he bought the 160-acre farm that is the farm in St. Mary's. How many of you have been to St. Mary's? I know we have some golds with us, a few of you. That's the original farm. That's where Gary did so much learning. That's where he did experimenting with building his distiller, with the angle of the pipes, the angle of the tubes, how long to distill, when to cut, when to harvest. All of that was the experimenting here in St. Mary's. It was a glorious time. And the ground was so hard, and the pH was so high, sorry, the pH was so low, it was like 4.5, and lavender grows in a 7 point. So it was a long ways away from being good ground for lavender to grow in. So he put liquid enzymes into the ground to help change that pH. It took him probably about 3 years, 4 years before he really got the ground to be where he wanted it to be. But he was still growing. I found this going through some of the files. I thought it was fascinating. I framed it and I kept it on his desk. He was always drawing, always creating, always looking for ways to make it better. It was fun to watch him in action because his mind never stopped. That was one of his biggest problems because he said, Mary, I can't turn my brain off, I can't sleep. And he was always experimenting. He evolved. We didn't have any money. I was with him out and back when he cut these logs, and he put the ends of them in tar so they wouldn't rot. And then he built the distillery himself. Come on, John. Oh, this is hilarious. Can you imagine harvesting peppermint with an oversized lawnmower? How long do you think that took? Oh my goodness, what an antiquated way to harvest. And Gary was a fabulous mechanic. He could weld and cut. I remember standing up on the road looking down while he was welding this together, and he was so excited about it. And you know what? It didn't do what he wanted it to do. All this work for nothing. He was most frustrated. But it was part of the learning. Then in the garage of the old house, he built the first cooker. And as you can see, we only had one piece of equipment, and he used that equipment for everything. Come on, John. You can see carrying the cooker down the road. And then he used that old front end. Oh, I have to tell you about this. Uncle Jack and Aunt Karma came to run the farm, and they lived in the old farmhouse. And Gary bought an old trailer and kept it out in back, and that's where he and the guys slept. I was lucky I got to sleep in the house, in the extra bedroom. But Uncle Jack was so wonderful, and he worked so hard with Gary, and this was the first steam. And the two of them were yelling and screaming. You could hear them all over the Gary did all of that himself, figuring out where the pipes would go, figuring out the old boiler. He said, oh, Gary, this is such a disaster. But he paid $500 for it. I was with him when he found it in the field, some farmer's field, and the farmer wanted to get rid of it, so we helped the farmer. Look at that look on his face. Oh, I remember it so well. It was such a glorious day. Come on, John. You can hear him, see him lifting out the straw, and he had to put weights on the back of the tractor because it would tip forward. The straw was so heavy. I was standing there. I watched all of it. It was amazing. Gary became friends with Philip Malbue. Philip had a big, what should I say, a big learning center in France. I was there with Gary. And Philip was investigating the emotional aspects of the oils. Gary immediately caught on. He immediately wanted to tell the world about how essential oils could strengthen your emotional body, strengthen your well-being, help uplift, strengthen your thought process. How you could connect, perhaps, to the energy beyond that which we can see. Oh my goodness, Gary had such a knowing. He started to talk about it in the meetings. And we used to get notes. This is not right. You can't be talking about these things. Essential oils don't do this. I'd get notes in the mail, little letters. Gary can't be talking about this sort of thing. This is not right. And I remember several letters that I answered, and I said, I am so sorry that you feel this way. But we are not going to change. If you don't like it, perhaps this isn't the right company for you. How many of you have discovered some kind of an emotional connection with the oils? We decided we would let you figure that out for yourself. Gary quit talking about it on stage. And now everybody wants to know about the emotional aspects of the oils. Gary started doing emotional clearing, and I saw amazing things happen. Many of us did. We were anxious to have a new building, a Young Living headquarters. And Gary had started drawing something. He started drawing the plans for the building clear back in the early days, clear back in 1994. And we kept saying, when? And he said, well, we can't do it right now. We have to put the money in the farms. About 2015, he said, well, I think we're ready. He interviewed the architects. He found one with whom he connected. He handed over this architect his architectural drawings. And they took what Gary had made and made it, what should I say, modern. Gave it all the bells and whistles that you see. It was very exciting for us. And when we started to move over, I was one of the last ones to clean out our office. It was just, I don't know, it was an emotional thing for me because Gary had just passed and I had a hard time getting into all the papers and reminding myself. He had off of his office a little back room that he was going to use for his draft table and his computer. But Gary didn't like the HP, and that's what was back there. And I was okay with the HP, so I took that office. But it was on Gary's desk. And Gary had them wire his little conference room so he could run his Apple in the conference room. So that's how I ended up in this little room. And I'm sitting there and I pulled open the drawer and I saw all these papers and I thought, oh, I suppose I should go through this. And I found this letter. I was shocked as I sat there and read it. It was so amazing that I have this framed in the museum. So when you go to the museum, you can read it in its entirety. But Gary had asked me if I would invest in his first company.